On the 11th of October 1652, a Dutch soldier named Jan Blank stands barefoot on the stone floor of a coastal fort at Table Bay, his wrists locked behind his back in iron cuffs. Commander Jan van Riebeeck sits behind a wooden desk across the room, a quill in one hand and a written verdict in the other. Blank had vanished 9 days earlier, slipped away from his post at the edge of the settlement and disappeared into the scrubland east of the fort. Search parties found him crouching in tall grass less than a mile from the perimeter, sunburned and half-starved, with no weapon and no plan. Van Riebeeck did not need a trial. Under the laws of the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the Dutch East India Company, a fort commander held the authority to judge and sentence his own men without a jury, without appeal, and without delay. The deliberation lasted 2 hours. The sentence filled 3 lines on a single page. Jan Blank would be keelhauled, then given 150 lashes, and then sold into forced labor for 2 years. 9 days of hiding in the grass had earned him all of this. Outside the fort, a Dutch supply vessel rides at anchor in the cold green water of Table Bay. 2 sailors crouch at the port rail, feeding a length of heavy rope down the hull and under the keel. A third man wades chest-deep in the shallows on the starboard side, catching the rope end as it surfaces and hauling it up through a wooden block bolted to the rail. The line now runs a complete loop beneath the ship, port to starboard, crossing the lowest point of the hull where the timber curves inward and the growth is thickest. This vessel has not been careened in over 4 months. Below the waterline, every plank is buried under a dense crust of barnacles, each shell a small formation of calcium carbonate with edges as rough as broken pottery. Sailors who scrape hulls during careening wear thick leather gloves to protect their hands. Even with gloves, they come away with cuts. Without them, a single pass of a bare palm across the surface opens the skin instantly. That is the texture waiting beneath this ship. Guards walk Blank down the stone path to the shore. His shirt has already been cut away. The October wind off the South Atlantic hits his bare chest and his skin contracts across his ribs. Table Bay in October holds water temperatures around 5 degrees, cold enough to stop a man's breathing on impact, cold enough to lock the muscles in his arms and legs within seconds. 2 sailors tie the rope to his wrists and ankles. His feet hang over the waterline. He can see the dark curve of the hull dropping away beneath the surface, and below it, the pale, rough crust covering the keel like a layer of broken stone. The officer on deck raises one hand. The men on the starboard side wrap the rope around their fists. With a single command, the sailors holding Blank release him. His body drops and hits the water chest first. At a fall of roughly 12 to 15 feet, the surface strikes his torso with the force of a hard floor, driving the air from his lungs in one exhale. Salt water floods his nose and mouth. The cold seizes his body all at once, and before he can draw breath, the rope pulls taut and he begins to move sideways, dragged along the hull toward the keel. The passage takes roughly 20 to 30 seconds. 20 seconds underwater, bound in freezing water, with the full weight of his body pressed against the roughest surface on the ship. When the hauling crew heaves Blank above the starboard rail, the man who comes out of the water is not the man who went in. He is conscious, he is breathing, but according to the sentence Van Riebeeck signed that morning, this is not the end. The keel hauling is only the first of 3 punishments. 150 lashes and 2 years of forced labour still remain. The word keelhauling appears in almost every pirate story, pirate film and pirate video game ever made. But the man who just went through it was not a pirate. He was an employee of the largest trading corporation on Earth, punished by his own government under written law, with witnesses and a signed order. The punishment was never invented by outlaws. It was invented by the state. The men who designed it wore uniforms, collected salaries, and reported to admirals. The rope, the barnacles, the hull, all belonged to the company. So how did a government punishment become the most famous pirate torture in popular culture? And what did it actually do to the human body, second by second, from the first drop to the last gasp of air? To understand keelhauling, you first need to understand the thing that made it lethal. Not the rope, not the water, the hull itself. Every wooden ship that spent more than a few weeks in tropical or temperate waters became a host for marine life. Barnacles attached to the timber within days of a vessel entering the water. These are not soft creatures. A mature barnacle builds a shell out of calcium carbonate, the same mineral found in limestone, and it cements itself to the wood with a bond stronger than most man-made glues. Within 3 months, a ship's bottom could carry a layer of shell growth thick enough to reduce its speed by nearly half. The edges of these shells are irregular, jagged, and hard enough to score iron. Surgeons aboard Dutch East India Company vessels recorded that men assigned to hull scraping during careening routinely needed treatment for deep cuts to their hands and forearms, even through leather protection. This is why keelhauling was not just a drowning. If the punishment was simply holding a man underwater, it would have been no different from a dozen other forms of maritime discipline. What separated keelhauling from everything else was the hull. The ship became the instrument. The same vessel that carried the crew across the ocean, the same timber they maintained and repaired with their own hands, turned into something else entirely when a man's body was dragged across its underside. Every sailor who ever scraped a hull understood this. They knew what was down there. They had felt it through their gloves. The mechanics were precise and regulated. The Dutch Navy codified keelhauling as an official punishment, written into naval ordinances as early as the 15th century. By the 1600s, it carried specific procedures. The condemned man was stripped to the waist and bound at the wrists and ankles. A line was rigged from the port yard arm down into the water under the keel and up to a block on the starboard side. The length of rope was critical. Too much slack and the man would sink deep enough to pass beneath the keel without touching it, which defeated the purpose. Too little slack and the man's body would be pulled tight against the hull at the turn of the bilge, the widest point of the curve, where the barnacle growth was densest. Getting the rope length exactly right was the bosun's job, and it was a job that determined whether the man below the waterline would survive. There were 2 directions a body could travel. A crosswise haul, port to starboard, dragged the man across the width of the ship. On a typical Dutch merchantman, this meant a passage of roughly 20 to 30 feet of submerged hull. A lengthwise haul, bow to stern, could cover 100 feet or more. The crosswise haul was survivable. The lengthwise haul was not. A man dragged the full length of a ship's bottom spent over a minute underwater, which exceeded the breath-holding capacity of almost any human under the stress of cold, pain, and panic. Dutch naval records indicate that a lengthwise haul was reserved for capital crimes, offences where the authorities expected the punishment to be fatal. The men assigned to pull the rope faced a decision that haunted them. Pull too slowly, and the man underwater would drown before reaching the other side. Pull too fast, and the friction against the barnacles would cause catastrophic damage to his body. There was no correct speed. Every rate of pull caused harm. The hauling crew could only choose which kind. William Falconer, a British poet and sailor who survived a shipwreck in the Mediterranean, published A Universal Dictionary of the Marine in 1769. His entry on keel hauling remains one of the most detailed descriptions from the era. Falconer noted that the Dutch performed the punishment, in his words, with a serenity of temper peculiar to that nation, and that the process was considered to have, again in his words, peculiar propriety in the depth of winter, when flakes of ice floated on the water. Cold water did not just increase the suffering. It slowed the body's responses, numbed the limbs, and made it physically impossible for the man beneath the hull to protect himself in any way. The French used a related punishment, but applied it differently. Instead of dragging a man beneath the keel, the French Navy tied the condemned to a wooden beam, hoisted him to the yardarm, and dropped him repeatedly into the sea from a height of 40 to 60 feet. Cannon shots were fired during the process to alert nearby ships, turning the punishment into a public spectacle, visible across the entire harbour. Falconer described this practice in the same entry, noting that the prisoner had several cannon shots fastened to his feet to increase the impact of each drop. The French method did not use the hull as a weapon, but the repeated high falls into open water carried their own set of consequences, and survival was far from guaranteed. What neither the French nor the Dutch method offered was a clean ending. A man who lived through keel hauling or repeated drops was not released and sent back to duty. He was left hanging from the rigging for hours, sometimes days, visible to every member of the crew. The purpose was not just punishment, it was communication. Every sailor who walked past that figure understood the message without a single word being spoken. If keel hauling belonged to the Navy, how did it end up in every pirate story ever told? The answer begins in a London bookshop in 1724. That year, a book appeared under the title A General History of the Pirates, credited to a man named Captain Charles Johnson. The book sold fast. It went through multiple editions within months and became the single most influential source of pirate lore in the English language. Nearly every popular image of piracy, the black flag, the buried treasure, the code of honor among thieves, traces back to Johnson's pages. The problem is that Johnson mixed documented fact with embellishment, rumor, and outright invention, and he did not always tell the reader which was which. Johnson never explicitly describes a pirate keel hauling, but his book created a world in which pirates were imagined as the most savage, most lawless, most terrifying figures on the ocean. Later writers, illustrators, and eventually filmmakers built on that foundation. If pirates were the ultimate villains of the sea, then they must have used the ultimate punishment of the sea. The logic was simple, appealing, and wrong. Keel hauling required a level of infrastructure, a rigged rope system, a disciplined hauling crew, a formal command structure that pirate vessels rarely possessed. Pirate ships operated on a system that would have struck any naval officer as absurdly democratic. Crews elected their captains. Quartermasters held veto power over the captain's decisions. The Articles of Agreement, the written rules that governed life aboard a pirate vessel, were voted on by every member of the crew before a voyage began. These articles specified exactly which punishments could be applied and for which offences. Dozens of these documents survive in court records from pirate trials held in London, Boston, and Kingston. Not one of them mentions keel-hauling. The punishments listed are practical, fast, and final. Marooning, flogging, a pistol ball. These were punishments that could be carried out in minutes with no special equipment. Keel-hauling required rigging, time, manpower, and a willingness to risk damaging the ship's own hull, none of which a working pirate crew could afford. There is a deeper reason keel-hauling does not appear in pirate records. Pirates lived under a permanent death sentence. Every man aboard a pirate vessel knew that capture by the Royal Navy meant a trial at the Admiralty Court and a rope at Execution Dock in Wapping, where the body would be left hanging in an iron cage until 3 tides had washed over it. When death is already the guaranteed consequence of your profession, the threat of a painful punishment loses most of its power. Naval officers used keel-hauling to maintain discipline among men who had something to lose: their careers, their pay, their pensions, their families waiting at home. Pirates had already given all of that up. A captain who tried to keel-haul a pirate crewman would have faced an immediate vote of removal, or worse, because the crew's loyalty depended on the understanding that no single man held that kind of power over another. The real practitioners of keel-hauling were not rebels. They were bureaucrats. The Dutch East India Company operated the largest commercial fleet in the 17th century world, with over 1,500 vessels and tens of thousands of employees spread across trading posts from Amsterdam to Nagasaki. Discipline on these ships was maintained through a formal legal code that specified punishments for every category of offence, from theft to desertion to striking an officer. Keel-hauling sat near the top of that code, reserved for the most serious crimes short of execution. A ship's captain could order it on his own authority, but he was required to record the sentence in the ship's log and report it to company officials upon return to port. The punishment was not secret. It was not improvised. It was paperwork. Christoph Frick, a German surgeon who served aboard Dutch East India Company ships in the late 1600s, published an account of his voyages that included a description of keel-hauling as standard company practice. Frick noted that a man found guilty of striking an officer was, without hope of pardon, to be thrown into the sea, fastened by a rope, thrown in on one side of the ship, and drawn up again on the other, and so 3 times together he is drawn round the keel of the ship. Frick added a detail that reveals how precisely the punishment was calibrated. If the crew did not allow enough rope for the man to sink below the keel, the victim's head could strike the hull at the turn of the bilge with enough force to kill him instantly. The difference between a survivable keel-hauling and a fatal one came down to a few feet of rope, measured and managed by the same crew who would eat dinner together that evening. By the early 1700s, keel-hauling was already fading from official use. The British Royal Navy had abandoned it by roughly 1720, preferring flogging as the standard severe punishment. The Dutch continued the practice longer, with the last documented official keel-haulings occurring around 1750. But the punishment did not disappear entirely. It moved into the shadows, into unofficial practice aboard ships far from home ports, where no admiral would ever inspect the log. And it was in that shadow form that keelhauling produced one of the most extraordinary survivor stories in recorded history. In 1871, a 17-year-old Spanish student named Pedro Ramon y Cajal failed an exam. This was not an ordinary academic setback. Pedro's father was a prominent physician, and the family expected excellence. Pedro's younger brother, Santiago Ramon y Cajal, would eventually win the Nobel Prize for his work founding the field of modern neuroscience. In this family, failure was not an option. Pedro chose a different option. He ran. He walked from his home in northeastern Spain across the border into France, reached a port town, and found a merchant vessel called the Queen preparing to sail for South America. Pedro had no money for passage. He hid himself aboard the ship and settled into the dark spaces below deck, surviving on stolen scraps from the galley. The Atlantic crossing from France to Uruguay took approximately 3 months. Somewhere in the middle of that ocean, the crew found him. A stowaway on a merchant vessel was not a guest. He was a thief. He had consumed food and water meant for paying passengers and working crew, and he occupied space on a ship where every square foot had a commercial value. The captain demanded payment. Pedro had nothing to offer. What happened next belongs to a category of punishment that had officially ended decades earlier, but continued in practice aboard ships operating far from any authority that might object. The crew keelhauled him. Pedro survived. The ship was relatively new and had been recently prepared for the voyage, which meant the hull below the waterline carried only a thin layer of marine growth. The barnacle crust that made keel hauling lethal on older vessels had not yet formed. Pedro went under the hull and came back up on the other side, bruised, scraped and shaken, but alive and functional. Within days, he was back on his feet. What Pedro did next suggests that keel hauling, while physically devastating on most ships, did not break him psychologically in the way it was designed to. Shortly after recovering, he became involved in a dispute with an Italian passenger aboard the same vessel. The argument escalated into a knife fight. The Italian did not survive. Pedro arrived in Uruguay sometime in early 1872 as a teenage runaway who had been keel-hauled, had survived a stabbing incident at sea, and now stood on the docks of Montevideo with no money, no contacts, and a dead man behind him on the ocean. He did what desperate young men in South America often did in 1872. He joined a war. Uruguay was in the grip of a civil conflict, and revolutionary forces were recruiting anyone who could hold a weapon. Pedro enlisted, fought, and took a wound to the chest severe enough to leave a scar he carried for the rest of his life. The injury pulled him off the front lines, and his commanding officers discovered something unexpected. Pedro could read and write. In an army where literacy was rare, this made him more valuable behind a desk than behind a rifle. He received a promotion and became personal secretary to Brigadier Timoteo Aparicio, one of the most powerful military figures in the country. A failed student from Spain had crossed an ocean as a stowaway, been keel-hauled, survived a knife fight, joined a foreign war, taken a chest wound, and risen to serve a general, all before his 21st birthday. And he was not finished. Within a few years, Pedro attempted to desert his position by stealing Aparicio's horse and pistol and riding into the countryside. He was captured, tried, and sentenced to death by firing squad. At the last moment, diplomatic intervention, reportedly arranged by his father back in Spain, secured a pardon. All charges were dropped. Pedro returned to Spain in 1878, alive against every reasonable expectation. He joined his brother Santiago in academic work, contributing to research in neurology and histology, the study of organic tissue in living organisms. He published, he taught, and he lived. Pedro Ramon y Cajal died in December of 1950 at the age of 96, making him almost certainly the last person alive who had personally experienced keelhauling, a punishment that had been invented by medieval navies, codified by the Dutch East India Company, and feared across every ocean on Earth, ended its history in the body of a Spanish teenager who failed a test and decided to run rather than face his father. The hull of the Queen was clean enough to let him live. On any older ship, on any vessel that had spent a full season in warm water without careening, the story would have ended in the Atlantic. Pedro's survival was not courage. It was the accident of a recently scraped hull and a short, crosswise haul. Every other element of his keel hauling, the rope, the cold, the drop, the passage beneath the keel, was identical to the punishment that had killed trained Dutch sailors 50 years before him. In 1882, a British journalist sat aboard a ship anchored off the coast of Alexandria, Egypt. He had been invited to observe a court-martial conducted under Ottoman naval authority. 2 Egyptian sailors had been convicted of attempted murder, and their sentence was keelhauling. The journalist worked as a correspondent for the London Morning Advertiser, and he had come expecting to write a routine dispatch about foreign military justice. What he witnessed instead left him unable to write for the rest of the day. The 2 men were tied together, back to back, and bound to a rope that had been rigged lengthwise along the keel of the ship, bow to stern. This was not a crosswise haul. This was the full length of the vessel, the version of the punishment designed to be fatal. The men were shoved from the gangway, a drop of roughly 14 feet to the water surface. Both screamed as they fell. The surface impact alone, at that height, with hands and feet bound, would have been enough to stun them. Then the rope pulled taut, and they disappeared beneath the hull. The correspondent noted the time. 24 seconds passed before the 2 men reappeared on the opposite side of the ship. He wrote later that those 24 seconds felt like an hour. When the crew hauled them up, both men were unrecognizable from what they had been less than a minute earlier. The correspondent attempted to describe what he saw, but the details overwhelmed his capacity for professional detachment. He tried to write his account that evening and could not finish it. He abandoned the draft and did not return to it until later. The men were forced through the process a second time. After the second pass, both were unconscious. The crew pulled them up the side of the vessel, their bodies striking against the ring bolts, chains and iron fittings that lined the hull above the waterline. They were laid on the deck. The correspondent asked an officer whether the men were still alive. The officer replied that it was not a matter of public concern. The crew then offered the journalist coffee and cigarettes. He declined. He wrote later that he would rather have seen the entire ship's company face a firing squad than accept hospitality from the officers who had carried out what he had just witnessed. This account, published in a late 19th century issue of the Marlborough Express, after being reprinted from the London Morning Advertiser, is one of the last first-hand descriptions of keel hauling in the historical record. By 1882, the punishment had been officially abolished by every major European navy. The British had stopped by roughly 1720. The Dutch had followed by 1750. The French continued longest, with documented cases into the mid-19th century. But abolition on paper did not mean abolition in practice. Ships at sea operated beyond the reach of inspectors, newspapers, and public opinion. What happened below the waterline stayed below the waterline. In 1880, 2 years before the Alexandria incident, a Member of Parliament named George Shaw Lefebvre confronted the British Admiralty with a report from Italy alleging that a keel hauling had been carried out aboard HMS Alexandria, a Royal Navy ironclad. The Admiralty denied the allegation. No investigation followed. The question was dropped. Whether the event occurred or not, the fact that it was raised in Parliament proves that keel hauling had not fully vanished from the sea even 160 years after its official abolition. Old ships carry old barnacles. Old navies carry old habits. The painting that best captures what keel hauling meant to the men who witnessed it hangs in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. It was painted in 1660 by Lieve Pieters Verschuyer, a Dutch Golden Age artist, and it depicts the keel hauling of a ship's surgeon aboard a vessel commanded by Admiral Jan van Ness. The painting does not focus on the man in the water. It focuses on the crowd. Hundreds of sailors and officers stand on every available surface, on the deck, in the rigging, on neighbouring ships, watching the rope move. Their faces show no outrage, no protest, no visible discomfort. They watch the way a factory crew watches a machine operate. The punishment is not a scandal. It is a procedure. That is the truth about keel hauling that pirate movies will never show you. It was not chaos. It was not the work of drunken outlaws on a lawless sea. It was the product of written codes, signed orders, measured ropes, and sober men doing precisely what their employers told them to do. The most feared punishment in maritime history did not belong to the men who broke the law. It belonged to the men who enforced it. Every navy that used keel hauling believed it was necessary, believed it maintained order, believed the pain it caused served a greater purpose. The Barnacles did not care about purpose. The rope did not care about law. And the hull of the ship did not know the difference between a pirate and a patriot. It simply did what any rough surface does when a human body is dragged across it at speed. Jan Blank, the Dutch soldier who knelt on the floor of a fort at Table Bay in 1652, left no further trace in the historical record after his sentence was carried out. We know that he received the 150 lashes. We know that 2 years of forced labour were assigned. We do not know whether he survived long enough to serve them. Pedro Ramon y Cajal, the teenager who was keel-hauled on a clean hull in the middle of the Atlantic, lived to 96 and died in his bed in 1950. Between those two men, separated by 200 years and an ocean of difference in fortune, lies the entire history of a punishment that the sea eventually outgrew, but never fully forgot.